Okay, it is just past 1 p.m. Eastern, so why don't we go ahead and get started. Welcome from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's National Conservation Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. My name is Mark Cantillari, and today's webinar is titled Principles of Ecological Silviculture and Applications in a Changing Climate. And we're excited to have Anthony D'Amato, Professor of Silviculture and Applied Forest Ecology and Director of the Forestry Program at the University of Vermont with us today. We'll be introducing Tony in just a moment, but first I'd like to remind you of a few pre-webinar items. I'd like to start this webinar by sharing NCTC's land acknowledgement with you all. The National Conservation Training Center is located on the ancestral lands of many indigenous peoples. These include, but are not limited to, the Massawomack, the Haudenosaunee, the Shawnee, and the Delaware. NCTC is dedicated to building relationships with indigenous communities, and we encourage others to learn more about the lands where they reside. I'm happy to share a link to those interested where you can learn more about the inhabitants of the land where you live and work. I also want to mention that we at NCTC welcome all students. It is my intention to create a safe, inclusive, and productive webinar environment that honors and supports diverse ideas. We are strengthened by diverse perspectives and identities, and we will foster an environment where everyone can learn new skills. As such, I will be an ally in the event that anyone experiences access issues or feels unwelcomed. You may always reach out to me privately to address your concerns. All right, and thank you for tuning in to this first presentation for the Ecological Forestry in the Context of Climate Change webinar series. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Ecology Working Group, Science Applications and Migratory Bird Programs, and the National Conservation Training Center are joining the USDA Northern Forest Climate Hub, the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and the USDA Forest Service in sponsoring this webinar series. CEU credits are available for this series. All you have to do is contact Jim Siegel at the email address listed if you would like credit. And we will add that email address to the chat here shortly. As a disclaimer, this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. This webinar is being recorded live and all participants have been muted, and it will remain that way for the duration of the webinar. However, we do want you to participate, so please at any time during the webinar, post questions into the chat. To submit a question, first click the chat icon located at the bottom of your screen, then simply type your question in the chat box. Be sure to select everyone from the drop-down menu and then press enter. Please feel free to enter questions at any point during this webinar, and we will pause halfway through the presentation to take questions. If you wish to change your presentation view, you can access different view modes in the upper right-hand corner of your screen as shown on this slide. And without further ado, I'm now going to turn it over to our host, Jeff Horan, to tell us a little bit more about this series, as well as introduce our wonderful speaker today. All right, Jeff, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Mark, for getting us set up. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And if you can switch to the next slide, that would be awesome. So thanks for everybody who joined us today. You know, we've been on hiatus with this series for the last, since March. And so this is the 5th series this group has put together, and the last 3 of them have been kind of 12-part stories 12-part series where we kind of tell a story over 12 months, a related kind of theme. And so again, this is a 12-part monthly webinar series. In this case, we're talking about how small and large scale forest disturbance, fire, wind, ice storms, hurricanes, sea level rise, et cetera, and also forest pests and how that impacts these ecosystems. The series will also examine ecological silviculture in a major way and climate adaptation approaches to help inform forest and wildlife management. So I also thought I would just give you a real quick preview of what's ahead of you. I'm going to introduce Tony in just a minute. And so you see, we start with, really just, okay, let's look at ecological silviculture. What do we mean by that? And how does it differ from traditional silviculture? Then our next webinar will be October 31st. And you should note that it was originally scheduled for, we always try to meet on the third Tuesday of each month at 1. But in this case, in order to get Jennifer, we had to switch that date to October 31st. And Jennifer Costanza is with the U.S. Forest Service Southern Research Station, and she just recently finished working on the Resource Planning Act assessment that just came out. And so that's just a big look at forests across the country, and she's going to give us a bit on disturbance regimes. But then we get into synergistic effects of multiple stressors, and that's Christina Eisenberg. Then we have Brenda McComb, who is no stranger to this series. She did a foundations of forest wildlife ecology with us, a 5-part series in the past, and she'll be talking about forest disturbance and its relationship to wildlife habitat. Next up, Mark. So then we get into next year, and we're still on our themes here. And again, you'll see that this year, in the past, we've kind of been at a high level, but this series tries to get down on the ground, and it really looks a lot at the silvicultural text that's going to come out soon called Ecological Silvicultural Systems. And so we really want to get down into each of these ecological silvicultural systems and see what we're doing on the ground. So in January, we talk about intermountain mixed conifer and interior dry pine forests. And right now we're still waiting to confirm our speaker there, so I won't put them in there yet. So what? I didn't agree to that. So, and then February 20th, we have climate adaptation strategies for longleaf pine with Steve Jack at Temple Foundation. March 19th, we have ecological silviculture for southern Appalachian hardwood forests, and that's Tara Kaiser, who works for the USDA Forest Service in the Southern Research Station. We move on to talking about creating wildlife habitat in degraded northern hardwood and mixed Acadian ecosystems, and that's Tom LaPointe with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And you also notice we kind of mix academics and practitioners throughout. And today, Tony's probably both. He's mostly an academic, but he's also certainly a practitioner. And then in May, we talk about in May we talk about central hardwoods with Miranda Curson. Move on to southern bottomland hardwood systems, and that's Haven Barnhill, who's part of our forest ecology working group, as is Tom LaPointe. And then we move on to head back out west with Klaus Putman, who will be talking about Douglas fir, western hemlock forests. And then I think last, Mark, I need one more slide. I see you're busy with the chat too, but hang on, I think I couldn't see the bottom. Maybe I didn't scroll up. I think we had, maybe I can't see that. So I know, so we finish up with Brian Palick, who's going to really just wrap up our series. And then I'll go ahead and introduce Tony. All right, so we have kind of abused Tony here a bit through our series. He's played a key role in a number of our series, and he, as many of you know, he's professor of silviculture and applied forest ecology, and he's also director of the forestry program at the University of Vermont. He has a BS in forest ecosystem science from UMaine. He has an MS from Oregon State University, and his PhD comes from the University of Massachusetts. And he was a faculty member for 7 years at the University of Minnesota and a Bullard Fellow at Harvard's University's Harvard Forest. And I think you guys may already know his research focuses on long-term forest dynamics, and you're going to hear about some of that today. We've had a chance to work with him at Fish and Wildlife Service on some of the applied silviculture for climate change projects. We're just starting to set some up on some of our refuges, and we're very, very excited to be working with him on that, and with NIAX. And so we're going to talk more about that today. So Tony, thanks so much for kicking off our series, and we look forward to the presentation. And just to let folks know, we are going to stop about halfway through. So if you have questions as you're moving through, you can start putting them in the chat. You might want to wait till people identify themselves and then start putting them in, but you don't have to wait. Mark and I will pull them out of there, and we'll take just a question or two halfway through to give people a breather, and then we'll be able to take a few more at the end. So thanks for joining us, and look forward to the presentation. Take it away, Tony.
Thanks, Jeff, for that nice introduction, and Mark as well. And thanks people for logging on. I really feel honored to be part of this series, and I guess part of this group for a third time. A really amazing community of managers and scientists and others coming together around some pretty key issues. So I appreciate the chance to present today. And really the goal, as Jeff was indicating, is to kick off this series and try to the best of my ability, lay some of the groundwork for thinking about ecological silviculture in general. So really just clarifying when many of us are talking about that, what we view as some of the core principles of that, and then crosswalk aspects of that to how do we think about how these principles and their outcomes really intersect with changing dynamics in our environment, both in terms of climate change as well as other elements. And so as Jeff showcased, the goal really being, as this series goes on, certainly other presenters digging a bit deeper into specific forest types. And so today, my goal really is a broad overview. And so those that have heard such overviews before from me or snored through them before, it's another chance for you to snore through them again. So hope it's not too much reruns for some of you. So as we get into thinking about ecological silviculture, I think just to provide some context, we're really going to be talking about managing ecosystems for diversity of values and really thinking about how it fits with goals around biodiversity conservation, but also global change adaptation. But where we sit today and think about just the global forest estate, clearly there's an increasing demand on our forests as a source of raw materials, both in terms of consumables like packaging, but more importantly, a lot of discussion around the need for more affordable housing, and importantly, trying to actually use green materials as part of that. And so the pressure on forests is not going away in terms of our consumptive uses. And what we generally see is that much of that consumptive uses is really provided by plantations, ecosystems where the primary focus is on kind of growing that forest crop, as opposed to really thinking more about some of the other values we'll be talking about today. And so the reason I bring this up is that, there's a lot of opportunity with ecological silviculture to both certainly sustain and provide wood products, but also really address some of the increasing proliferation of invasive insects and diseases, changing climatic regimes, as well as just changes in the way we're looking at our forests through the lens of biodiversity conservation and climate mitigation. And so really making sure that we're aware of that when we're talking about ecological silviculture, it's not just about outcomes as it relates to diversity or outcomes as it relates to adaptation, but we're thinking globally, how does this also fit into kind of our use of wood products as consumers, and where does ecological silviculture fit into that solution to sustaining those values over time? So I really want to acknowledge that much of what I'll talk about today, if you disagree with it, thankfully you can blame somebody else besides me. A lot of what I'll be talking about in particular comes from working with Brian Palick. He's just been an amazing collaborator and really someone that I think has done so much to advance kind of the application of ecological silviculture into practice via the textbook on the left-hand side, as well as Jeff mentioned, a forthcoming collection of ecological silvicultural systems for basically 19 different places around the globe, where people are taking ecological silviculture and localizing it to their environment. But I also want to certainly recognize people like Jerry Franklin, Norm Johnson, Klaus Putman's name was mentioned already, Bob Seymour, others that have really certainly advanced this application of ecological silviculture and how it fits into the landscape today. And so much of what I'll talk about is really where we're at in terms of an understanding of this broad discipline, as well as kind of the four overarching principles that we think about as guiding what we do out in the forest when we're following these models. So when we define ecological silviculture, really the core of this is taking an understanding of natural systems and using that to develop management strategies that are encouraging various aspects of the structures and functions and dynamics that we would have observed, following some natural disturbance regime within a given ecosystem over time. And so really using an understanding of of how forests operate and develop, and using that as a way to really achieve those values I was talking about in that intro slide, and not just environmental goals, but also trying to sustain desired economic and social outcomes. And Mark's introduction certainly is a good reminder that even though we think of ecological silviculture and this idea of using understanding of the natural system as a model of stewardship, as an idea that came around beginning in the 1930s in the US, we all recognize and are increasingly learning from indigenous models that pre-existed, predated any of our kind of Western knowledge about forestry in North America, that certainly already were exemplifying many of these principles of working with the forest and using an understanding of those dynamics to sustain various values. And so it's important to recognize this is not something new in kind of stewardship in North America.
Hey, Tony,
So,
I hate to interrupt you. I hate to interrupt you here. Our captioner has asked if you could just slow down a little bit when you speak, if that's okay.
Eastern Mass delivery, I apologize. And it's a 12-minute introduction. I'm trying to carve some time off here. So,
I understand.
Yeah, I try my best. Yes, sorry about that. Yeah.
Thank you.
So when we think about ecological forestry and how we might contrast that with those plantation models, and more broadly, it's not just forest plantations, but any forest where we're managing for kind of a primarily emphasis on harvesting a forested crop. What's important to recognize first, as I keep saying, we are cutting trees with ecological silviculture, but the emphasis and the outcomes really are quite different than what we might consider a timber-focused model. And so this table on the screen that you're looking at really is just contrasting kind of 4 different attributes of ecological forestry relative to timber-focused forestry. And so certainly the first thing with ecological forestry is much of what we're trying to do, building off of that natural underpinning, is trying to maintain an ecosystem and all of the structures and functions and biota that are out there beyond just the timber and economic outputs. Whereas timber-focused forestry really is trying to maintain a subset of that ecosystem that's focused primarily on those biota that are going to kind of generate the highest economic return, both in terms of timber and non-timber products. Likewise, kind of the model that we're using to guide ecological forestry is, and we'll talk about this kind of later in the presentation, an understanding of natural disturbance dynamics and stand developmental models. And so really using that natural disturbance-based approach for management, as opposed to a more agronomic model where we're trying to really emphasize aspects of kind of what's most efficient and productive for plant growth, and in particular that crop. Likewise, we'll talk a lot about complexity and heterogeneity, but that really is an outcome that we're trying to both create and maintain, as opposed to a more timber-focused model where we're really focused on, again, that what's going to create the most equal allocation of growing space to our crop and also make it easiest for us to harvest those systems over time. And then finally, we'll talk a lot about diversity and resilience, but a lot of what we're trying to do is emphasize those as emergent properties of these ecosystems, as opposed to really trying to kind of focus in on what is optimizing growth of the productive species that we want on that site. So one way to look at this figure that Abe Wheeler produced as part of that upcoming book. And this is really based on experience working with Douglas fir forests in Oregon, and a way to illustrate just some differences in terms of how we might look at a forest site through the lens of ecological silviculture, as opposed to through the lens of primarily timber focus. And so the way this is broken up, and again, these percentages are more just for illustration purposes. This isn't an exact science as to how anyone might allocate a given area. But in an area being managed for ecological silviculture, there's still certainly a component, in this case, 65% of that site, that is being focused in on trees that are being viewed as part of commercial timber production. Whereas in contrast, again, no surprise. And if you're managing a plantation or an area where you really want to maximize timber production, really that as much as that set as possible that you can allocate is going to be devoted to timber. Other aspects that then eat up that 35% that's not being focused solely on production really get around things like species that might not be commercially, but certainly ecologically important. In the case of leaving trees behind to grow large and old, so kind of leaving things out there. These forests have kind of an extended pre-forest stage. So instead of immediately going out there and trying to replant and revegetate every single square foot of that forest, allowing parts of that forest to slowly fill in or even stay open for long periods of time. And then finally, trying to maintain and protect existing snags and downwoody material out in that site. And so really what this contrast gets at is that there are certainly some trade-offs from an economic standpoint, right? If you're really trying to maximize return, depending on what your rate of return is for a given ownership, it might be hard to devote 35% to non-productive components. But for those areas where we're thinking about ecological silviculture, we really need to acknowledge that much of that productivity we're trying to actually funnel into other aspects of ecosystem dynamics that are potentially not going to result in a timber crop. So what I'm going to go through really are kind of the 4 overarching principles of ecological silviculture. And as I go through these, I'll be crosswalking where appropriate aspects of these principles that also relate to adaptation. And so again, the broader goal of this webinar series is really to dig deeper into this and certainly talk a lot more about global change and how kind of localized examples of adapting the change. And so my hope here is really just to kind of go through kind of these principles and just outline that even though the intent of many of these principles originally revolved around things like biodiversity conservation, many of their outcomes also really generate some promise as it relates to adapting to changing conditions and what we might do out there on the landscape. So the first principle of ecological silviculture, and kind of one of the ones that I think many of us often think most closely emulates aspects of kind of the archetype of ecological silviculture, is this notion of continuity. And importantly, as that graph I was showing earlier of ecological forestry versus timber focused forestry shows, a lot of what's being emphasized is what's left behind following harvest. And so instead of the traditional model where we're really focused on harvest removals, we're also factoring in what are we leaving behind, and importantly, how are we actually integrating into our management that knowledge we all have of the importance of biological legacies in influencing both the resilience of an ecosystem as well as the persistence and survival of different species as we transition potentially from an old forest condition to a young forest condition, or to a closed canopy patch into a more gappy patch. And so one kind of simple example of looking at continuity in action, and one of many studies that really led to a better understanding of just how important leaving things behind as part of the disturbance process, both naturally as well as human generated, is just illustrated through these black and white photos initially. So this is an old growth forest in 1906 in southwestern New Hampshire. This is that exact same forest in 1938 after it was blown down by a hurricane, and no salvage harvesting happened in this forest. And so they allowed that wood to lay on the ground. This is land owned by Harvard Forest. And so they really studied how does this change if we don't do anything following disturbance. And so if we visit that forest today, there are kind of 2 key aspects. One is pretty obvious: the trees that were left in the ground, you still have this very complex forest condition in terms of dead wood in various stages, microtopography due to tip-up mounds. But what's also out in this forest is that much of the recovery of that ecosystem, if you can see the species here, was hemlock that was existing as advanced regeneration during that disturbance. And so that legacy of just that advanced regen being protected gave that forest a pretty quick recovery mechanism following that disturbance event, and really convert some resilience. And so trying to kind of maintain that continuity pre-disturbance to post-disturbance through our activities. So what this has really been translated into, over the years, and often kind of the way people think of, oh, it's ecological silviculture because you're leaving trees behind. Yeah, that's part of it. And I think it's in many cases was a major change for different parts of the country and different parts of the world, where we were primarily using even age systems and recognizing that even age regeneration method didn't fully emulate those legacies that might be left behind following a stand replacement disturbance. So these photos here are different examples of what people might call leave trees, legacy trees, green trees, reserve trees, retention harvest. All of these terms really became popularized over the past 30 years as more and more of us have started to think about how do we modify traditional silvicultural regimes to acknowledge that we are leaving trees out there as a source of that continuity going forward. An important point is, those of you looking through these terms, we see reserve trees, and that's not a new term, right? That's in the silviculture vernacular, dating back to the first English, silviculture textbooks in North America. But historically, when we talked about leaving reserve trees behind, like a shelter would with reserves, there was still the intent to go back out and harvest those trees ultimately. And so it's a very different intent than truly leaving trees behind out in that forest to get large and get old and to die. And to that point, a lot of what we're trying to achieve in many cases, and it's a very different way of thinking than textbook in 1960 might tell us in terms of the best way to manage the forest, is that if we're managing for this continuity, we really need to be making sure we're making conscious decisions to leave trees in the woods to die. And basically the goal being both to restore that large tree component, something I'll talk more about later, that's sorely lacking from many of our forests, but also to really allow for the natural development and evolution of cavities and snags and things that take a very long time to naturally evolve out in the forest. And so this lower panel of pictures is showing, artificially created cavities, artificially created kind of high stumps, and then 3 different flavors of artificial snag creation at the Seney Refuge. And those are certainly fast ways to create snags and fast ways to create cavity trees. But really the best way to create cavity trees is often to allow trees to naturally evolve and heart rot and decay to take over and really create those structures, as opposed to kind of just killing any given tree and hoping it is also going to serve as a great cavity tree. And so if given the choice and have the opportunity to do it on your land, you're just letting things out there as long-term legacy trees to die is a much more effective way to restore those structures than just creating them overnight. So I'm going to be going through these for all 4 of them, but these are kind of a snapshot of a portion of a table in the textbook that Brian Palick led. It really highlights kind of 3 main themes tied to each principle of ecological silviculture. And so the first being continuity, and each of those themes being commodity production, biodiversity conservation, and global change, resilience, and adaptation. And so the center theme, biodiversity conservation, really is what was the main guide for much of the generation of ecological silviculture and the formalization of that discipline. And so leaving things behind, certainly a lot of the ideas around lifeboating species, certainly providing that future source of large snags and dead wood for species that rely upon those substrates, as well as providing that diversity of food and energy sources for canopy species by having kind of a range of tree sizes and canopy complexities. But if we look at this idea of leaving trees out there on the site or leaving dead wood out there on the site in the context of global change, resilience, and adaptation, it also provides this option in the face of uncertainty for regeneration. So if we're leaving kind of sexually mature trees out on that site, or in some cases even protecting advanced regeneration, we're leaving future seed sources or future individuals that may potentially provide some promising pathways forward on a site as things are changing. Likewise, those that work in parts of the world, which I think all of us can raise our hands at the way that things are going, where we have hot, dry conditions early in the growing season, when we're planting trees, we're trying to naturally regenerate trees, having that retention distributed across sites can serve as a really important way to ameliorate some of those extremes and kind of buffer that climate at the micro scale to try to provide those safe sites for regeneration. And then finally, just leaving trees there to die and live out their lifespans, no matter how long that might be, a week or another century, provides that opportunity to conserve that genetic diversity and potential pathways, again, for adaptation, depending on how things change. So moving on to the second principle, and the one that I would say is most commonly kind of directly translated into how we think about adaptation, is this principle of complexity. And so as we were talking about contrasting ecological silviculture with a timber-focused model, with ecological silviculture, really we are emphasizing that complexity in forest composition, forest structure, and we're doing else through our interventions. And so really trying to emulate aspects of both that disturbance regime, but also the long timeframes over which those disturbance regimes operates. And so creates that fine scale as well as mesogeneity in forest conditions over time. And so I think what becomes tricky is when we start talking about managing based on natural forests, and oftentimes people's minds go to, if we're talking about natural, we're talking about old forests, is that in most people's eyes, the first thing that jumps to mind, not this audience, we're highly enlightened, but most of us assume when we're talking about old forests, we're really talking about places that are wall-to-wall big trees, because that's the picture that we have in our mind. And to be honest, it's the picture that we all take when we're out there visiting those places. And so in many cases, we have this large tree bias when we talk about old forests, because there are large trees. And so I'm not trying to undersell this is how important large trees are as part of natural systems. But any of these pictures on the screen in front of you, there's a big tree and there's a person next to it, because that's what we do to show you how big the tree is. But if you look around that big tree, there is a lot of variability and complexity in the density of trees, the size of trees, and really speaking to that there's a lot more going on than just big trees in that forest. There's a lot of spatial variability, variability in density, variability in composition, and that's really an important underlying attribute of most natural forests when we look at them. And so as an example, and these are a couple of figures from chapters, Miranda Curzon and John Cabrick and Andrew Larson and Derek Churchill produced for this upcoming textbook, and I see Miranda will be presenting, which is awesome, as part of this session, just to illustrate, that variability in a couple of different forest types. And so on the left, we have a Gingrich style stocking chart. Most of us are well versed in looking at these if we work in the East, particularly in oak or hardwood systems. And so generally, when we think of stocking in our forests, we tend to think of from a management standpoint, we want forests between that the A line and the B line. This is kind of fully stocked condition. We don't want it above, we don't want it below. But what this illustration is really highlighting is that within even oak dominated ecosystems, many of us appreciate there's a tremendous range of variability in the density of those ecosystems naturally, as well as the density that was maintained through historic indigenous burning and other processes. And so there's managing just for closed canopy conditions, by trying to emulate what we view as kind of the archetypical and productive forest type is really underselling just the variability in spatial conditions and densities that exist with our oak forest types throughout various parts of the central hardwood region and more broadly, around the globe. Likewise, the picture on the right is a stem map of a mixed conifer forest out west. And it's pretty clear, from the colors and the openings and the darker areas that there's a whole range of spatial arrangements of trees in this forest. So clumps of trees, openings in this tremendous spatial complexity that if your goal was to optimize timber production, the last thing you would do is arrange trees in this spatial arrangement. But when we look at these natural ecosystems and what they have in terms of this long-term legacy of tree spatial arrangement that really reflects those disturbance regimes, it's quite complex and something that's critical for us to emulate with our management for various ecological and adaptation regions. And so what we often see that translated into from an ecological silviculture standpoint is that we move more into multi-age methods, and we'll talk a bit more about this towards the end, but in generally where we're doing kind of a combination of different openings of various sizes and thinning and not thinning and trying to create some of that spatial complexity and density and composition that would have existed under a more natural kind of mixed severity or gap scale disturbance regime. And so on the left, that LiDAR image you're looking at is just hybrid single tree group selection with patch retention. And where basically the goal is to kind of create kind of a range of gap conditions and anti-gap conditions that would have existed following kind of a fine scale wind disturbance regime. Likewise, on the right, we're looking at more of a continuous cover, regular shelter wood, trying to emulate what we might see with mesoscale wind events in hardwood forests. And down the bottom is kind of the layout for variable density thinning in spruce fir to try to kind of restore some of that complexity in a relatively young kind of homogeneous stand. And so my point for showing this is that, a lot of that principal complexity gets translated into the regeneration methods we're using and really varying that severity and intensity of our management across the site. Bringing it kind of further south, hardwood region and into the Southern Appalachian region, the picture on the upper left is just any gap over 100 meters squared in size following an intermediate disturbance Justin Hart was doing. So you can see that distribution of gaps following a natural wind event. We have kind of some scattered small gaps. We have some larger kind of clusters of gaps that collectively might be several acres in size. But throughout that, we see these areas that aren't being impacted in a whole range of conditions. And so these other images are actually showing from a silvicultural standpoint how we might emulate that regime by doing irregular shelter woods. And so kind of an initial entry where we're creating some of the pattern of gaps and then ultimately doing subsequent entries that might expand upon those gaps over time to really reflect that coalescing of gaps as that forest is evolving. So complexity, definitely strong ties to biodiversity conservation again, right? Trying to have that diversity, kind of a habitat-rich space where we have kind of a range of sizes, a range of dead wood conditions, et cetera. All those things that we think of, particularly for species that are relying on kind of complex forest conditions for nesting, roosting, foraging, trying to emulate aspects of that. But this really does translate, very strongly to what we're also talking a lot about in terms of global change, resilience, and adaptation. And so having that spatial variability and density, so open areas, widely spaced trees, dense trees, all throughout a stand, creating that variability in things like fuels and variability in the risk of those trees to wind, as well as having some differences in tree sizes and ages, which certainly will influence the vulnerability to a given pathogen or pest. And likewise, having that complexity and composition and structure is providing many different ways of that forest to recover over time, while also still certainly maintaining a lot on that side. So there's been a lot of great work, talking about kind of the linkages between kind of complex ecosystem conditions and adaptation. And I really like this figure that was put together by Klaus Putman and Christian Messier to really illustrate kind of what we're really talking about here in terms of managing for complexity and what that means in terms of the potential to sustain the goods and services and values that we want from forests over time. And so basically what this figure is showing is that we have kind of a forest starting here that's very simple, both in its stand structure and composition. And we have kind of this range of conditions that I'll circle here that we view as kind of desirable. That may be kind of the range of habitat that we need for a focal species, or the range of carbon storage that we view as ideal, or the range of aesthetic values that we view as being still acceptable from a societal perspective. And so if this forest is disturbed, because it's quite simple, it doesn't have many pathways to recover. And many of those pathways that it recovers or adapts by don't stay within kind of the acceptable range of what we're looking for. And so a more complex forest, we often think of having many more pathways that will stay within that range of conditions that we view as desirable into the future. And you'll notice that, the goal is not to kind of keep that forest the same or keep restoring it back to kind of a previous time. The idea is that we're trying to work with that system and create that complexity such that the adaptive pathways that forest follows into the future still stay within what we view as acceptable from a societal standpoint. Because in many cases, this adaptation and the rush to adapt is being driven by us, right? We are expecting things from forest in the future, and as things change, there's a lot of pressure to do so. So given that's a complex concept and a complex diagram, it's a good time for a question break, and hopefully people are keeping up. I apologize for the rapid speed to shave some time early on, but yeah, I'll stop for a couple of questions before rolling here.
All right, everyone can take a breath. So yeah, we have some good questions. So thanks for the questions that are coming in. And Tony, I think I'm going to actually wrap three into one because they really have a similar theme. And one of them's from Jessica, and others from Leslie, and the last is from Pia, I think. And they really are kind of similar. Jessica kind of asks, what about use of glyphosate? If you use glyphosate, is that more toward timber focused management, or can it also be considered ecological forestry? The next one, I'm going to pile it on here a little bit. Leslie describes a situation in New Jersey where you have rampant dying ash, you're losing beech. They had Hurricane Sandy, which, a lot of saltwater intrusion. And so they're being overwhelmed with invasives. Why is there a need to start creating additional silvicultural disturbance, or is that what ecological forestry is about? And the last question is really from Pia, and that's along that same kind of spectrum, and that is, how do you balance the need to create structural complexity with the risk of invasive vegetation taking over in these in these openings? So it's all kind of that same continuum. So if you can address that.
Really goes back to that previous slide in some respects, and that when we're talking about all of these changes that are going on, and there's kind of different ways of thinking about it. And there's certainly been a lot of discussion recently that the forest will be fine on its own. It's going to evolve and change. Invasives are going to do their thing, and in 100, 300, 400 years, the evolution of natural systems, we know that, they're amazing, and they're going to create these new novel things that aren't going to look like the forest that we currently have, or look like historical forests, but are going to certainly function as ecosystems. And so there's this idea that, we should intervene. Particularly, I think it's often influenced by those that have more of a paleo view of change in climate, where things did or change and evolve over long time frames. But what you're describing, with that scenario with the ash dying, saltwater incursion, beech leaf disease, that change is happening fast. And from a societal standpoint, I think the outcomes of that change we might view as undesirable, and maybe not fitting into what we view as like either socially acceptable or socially desirable, or maybe not providing the services that we were hoping from that ecosystem. And so those situations might warrant intervention, where we may try to actually, to the best of our ability, increase the adaptive capacity of that system such that It might not ever be kind of a coastal beech forest again, but it's still, but now we're encouraging a tree species that might still be able to get mature and provide that carbon benefit, or might produce, mass just like beech did. And so it's providing some of those values that beech did. And on the invasive front, same idea, if we're willing, I mean, invasives are a tremendous challenge. And so we could intervene and try to create more structural complexity. But if it's a high invasive area, we have to also, if we don't view invasive infestations as a desirable outcome, we have to be, as part of that management, treating those invasives. And so whether it's glyphosate, brush sawing repeatedly over and over again, I think all those tools are on the table for ecological silviculture. And it boils down to, again, the acceptability within either the agency you're working in, the acceptability for that landowner. But just because it's ecological doesn't mean it eliminates practices. It's just the intent of those practices might be different. So in that case, I'm using glyphosate as a way to try to sustain maybe native species and try to, at least ensure that my intervention to try to increase complexity and hopefully increase potential pathways forward is being done in a way that isn't actually exacerbating kind of the momentum that might be in that stand in terms of invasive species. But I think those are great questions, and it really boils down to, like, what do we view as acceptable in terms of the natural outcome if that progresses on its own. And I think a lot of the adaptation that we talk about, it's not because we don't think the ecosystem can figure it out, over time. It's that the way that those novel systems are going to evolve, we may lose some of the things that we currently rely upon as a society. And so adaptation is often being driven by that motivation, as opposed to we're worried that buckthorn won't fix carbon. It does. It's just different, in terms of what it's doing out there. So sorry to give buckthorn a compliment, but it's green, it's vegetation, so we just need to think about, like, what our values are, in those scenarios.
All right, we snuck 3 questions in as one, so we'll let you get back to the main thing here.
So it's good timing for the timing. So the third principle really kind of gets back to this idea of understanding kind of timeframes that things develop under. And so I was just talking a bit about timing and kind of ecosystem evolution and reorganization and reassembly. And so, if we totally lose a tree species, how long will it take for that to occur? But in the context of ecological silviculture, a lot of what we're getting at is that we recognize that our timeframes are very human driven. So, whether it's by economics, by kind of a certain desired outcome, and oftentimes those run counter or are different than the timeframes over which many of the features that we associate with natural systems, both that complexity and condition, representation of big and large old trees that just take time to accumulate. And so with the timing principle, we really are talking about applying these at ecologically appropriate time intervals. And so as an example for that, again, many of us are familiar with the idea of extended rotation systems, but it's one kind of simple example of how we're adjusting timing and making silvicultural decision-making to better reflect what may make kind of ecological sense, as opposed to how we historically defined it as biological or economic rotations. And so this figure is adapted from a really nice guide that the Wisconsin DNR's produced, one of many nice guides they've produced, looking at red pine management and how we think about what might be the appropriate rotation age for managing those stands. And so again, those familiar with how we work with areas where there's an expected high rate of return, often the economic rotation age is based on kind of maximizing net present value, and kind of the duration of that rotation is really going to be a function of the discount rate that we choose for that forest. So very much about optimizing economic return. The biological rotation age, as we've kind of defined it historically with silviculture, right? This is the peak mean annual increment, right? The maximum sustained yield for that forest. Often the source of information for that is a normal yield table, so not always the best approximation of every stand out there on the landscape, but nevertheless is often viewed as kind of the benchmark. And those familiar with the National Forest Management Act, this is kind of the criteria that has to be the minimum rotation for national forests. But with extended rotations, we're really talking about going beyond that biological rotation age and really using ecological criteria, as well as maybe some long-term economic objectives tied to big trees that might just guide you to go well beyond both the biological and certainly extremely well beyond the economic rotation. So as an example as to kind of how this plays out in terms of outcomes on the ground, the bar graph on the right is from an old growth forest at Tasca, Minnesota, some work that Eric Zenner and Geraldine Peck did. where you just can see the size distribution of that forest. So many trees, well over 55 centimeters in diameter. And on the left-hand side, actually is the outcome of some extended rotation research that's happened on the Cutfoot experimental forest in north central Minnesota. And so these are diameter distributions for 5 different forests that were all, at this point in time, 142 years in age. And so they're kind of well beyond what someone might say is the economic, and certainly well beyond the biological rotation. So if you look at kind of the lower stocking levels, and so these are different kind of stocking levels that have been maintained over time in this forest, and then kind of compare that to this old growth stand, these 142-year-old forests, because they've been thinned over time and allowed to go beyond biological rotation, have already started to move into structural conditions that are akin to what we would associate with old growth stands. And so the idea with extended rotations is not just to say we're not going to cut that forest for an additional period of time, but we're also going to do things like thin that forest and try to accelerate tree growth and structural and compositional complexity over time in that stand. So to that end, there's a lot of interest right now broadly in old forest conditions. And many of our forests, and this is some work that kind of summarizes conditions for the Northeast US, but this certainly translates to other parts of the US with a similar history of kind of intensive land use. And many of our forests, in where I work, are anywhere from 90 to 110 years old. And so there's a big push right now. We want more old forest. And so to get there, kind of one of the strategies being suggested, which I certainly agree with, is that we should just allow some areas to could naturally develop over time, on their own and develop these old growth characteristics. And so what this timeline is showing is that if we kind of do that, over the next 100 years, based on our understanding of tree growth and dynamics, if we're looking at kind of the benchmark conditions that we associate with old forests in terms of densities of large trees, it'll be another 100 years or so kind of following natural dynamics, assuming nothing's changing, which is not a good assumption for this webinar, but assuming nothing's changing, it'll take that long to get to that condition. At the same time, what we can do, because we know how trees respond to crop tree release, and Craig Lorimer really pioneered thinking around this in the 90s in Wisconsin, that we can actively try to accelerate kind of large tree growth and accelerate aspects of that complexity through management, and in many cases shorten the time frame it takes to get to these old growth characteristics. And so the diagram on the top is just showing, if we used crop tree release, 2 to 3 of those over the next 50 years in those same stands, we would shorten the time to get to that benchmark condition in terms of large tree densities across the landscape. And so the table on the bottom is just showing kind of the current condition in terms of the percentage of large tree densities that those forests have, and then how quickly it takes to get to kind of 100% of that target range of density. So that timing is not just kind of letting things go, but also understanding, can we actually influence the timing in ways that accelerate development of some of those structures that we're interested in. So I won't belabor this in terms of, kind of summarizing, but I think we appreciate that by taking that approach of leaving things for long time periods, as well as recognizing just the life cycles and the sensitivity of some of these species that require a long time period to disperse, whether it's from a tree or from a patch. This principle of timing really is meant to conserve those in the landscape, while also, again, leaving these long-term options for adaptation, as well as certainly minimizing some of those issues that were brought up in the questions about, are we compounding impacts by having frequent harvests over and over again? All right, last one, context. So now we're zooming out from the stand and really thinking about, at landscape scales or certainly ownership scales, how what we're doing from a management standpoint influences kind of the functions and kind of those cross-scale interactions, from the patch within a stand to kind of the stand interactions across a landscape, and really what that means in terms of affecting the biota that are working in kind of living in that ecosystem, as well as other outcomes in terms of impacts of disturbances and other processes happening across that area you're working in. And so when we think about landscape level planning and ecological silviculture, many of you are familiar with the triad concept developed in the early 90s, the University of Maine, with Bob Seymour and Mac Hunter, really articulating a quite visionary look at how we balance all of these things I talked about to begin with. Where we need wood, we also need areas that we can leave behind, and we also have areas where we might want to do more creative ecological silviculture. And so the triad concept, as many appreciate, was really designed as a way to balance, kind of a level of of intensity happening, for wood production relative to doing maybe more ecologically friendly, what they called new forestry at the time elsewhere, while also leaving behind places to be ecological reserves. And so this diagram on the left is really showing different shades of green, kind of reflecting kind of different levels of management, going from intensive production to no management at all. And so in terms of context as it relates to adaptation, again, for some of those questions, I'm certainly in the camp, and I think many are, that we're not going to necessarily manipulate every acre of the landscape and try to work with it to adapt to future change. Really, we're only working in some places with active management, and it doesn't make sense to be, for various reasons, trying to do more transition type treatments or extreme treatments everywhere. We want to make sure we're kind of maintaining a mosaic of different conditions across the landscape. And so one way to think of this context within the context of adaptation is that one of the more, I'd say, risky and in many cases, front edge approaches for dealing with climate change is that we're now more and more seeing interest in planting species that might be adapted to the future based on either their resistance to insects and diseases, or they might have a better climate profile in terms of the temperatures or moisture regimes they can withstand. And so there's certainly a lot of work, and we're involved with it and supportive of it, where we think about, are there ways for us to actually increase the adaptive capacity of a given area by either planting species that are currently present in the landscape, but if we had more of them, that might actually increase the adaptive portfolio of that stand, or moving species to places that they would naturally be able to migrate to if they could run as fast as I talk, or as even better, as fast as climate's changing. And so in both those cases, we recognize that not every landowner wants to do that. And so the idea is that, if we're doing this type of planting as part of adaptation, we're doing it in the context that we're acknowledging where's other planting happening across the landscape, and can we think about the functional linkages between those places in other areas out there that may either aren't receiving planting or are kind of getting at a lower scale, such that over time, as things change and as climate continues to evolve, we're really acknowledging there are going to be these cross-scale interactions between these populations of trees that are going to influence kind of broader dynamics. And so the diagram on the right really is based off of, again, some work that Christian Messier and Klaus Putman have advanced, really thinking about understanding the functional linkages between what we're doing out there and what that might mean for conferring broader adaptation benefits across the region. So I summarized it already, but again, thinking about kind of how we at the landscape scale are evaluating adaptation. I'm definitely a stand-to-stand thinker, but how does that kind of perpetuate itself for broader scales, both in terms of biodiversity conservation, but also in terms of adaptation going forward. So I'm going to end kind of transitioning us towards, what the remainder of the webinar series will be, particularly that latter half into the winter, and really just kind of push back on the notion that's been put forth by some that if I just leave trees behind following harvesting, I'm doing ecological silviculture, and that is not ecological silviculture. We don't just leave things behind and walk away and check the box and say we're done with that site, right? Our traditional training, as well as our training in ecological silviculture, is really to think about a long-term sequence of treatments applied to a forest over time to meet a long-term desired future condition, whether that be restoration or adaptation. So a lot of what we use in ecological silviculture to guide that decision-making are natural disturbance regimes. And so these will certainly be talked about a lot more in subsequent parts of the webinar series, but really looking at kind of what is the underlying disturbance regime for this ecosystem, and what can we learn from that in terms of what might make sense for continuity and complexity and timing and context, those four principles. How does that actually manifest itself when I factor in both the historic disturbance regime as well as how things might be changing? So there's four kind of broad ways we organize disturbance regimes for ecological silviculture. And so really ranging from those forests that really have very infrequent but severe disturbances, so whether that be jack pine or lodgepole pine or Douglas fir, so basically long periods without disturbance, but very important stand disrupting disturbances. Forests that have very frequent low severity disturbances, so longleaf pine, ponderosa pine being good examples. Where I work a lot, forests where we have mostly gap scale disturbances, mostly from wind, and then those where we have more of a mixed severity disturbance regime, and that really exists across a lot of landscapes, but certainly very important as we get into mixed conifer forests in the lake states and in the West. And so what those are used to do is really inform ecological silvicultural systems, right? So we're not just retaining trees and saying, I get my merit badge for ecological silviculture, right? We have a plan over time for that forest where we're using treatments to restore and maintain and enhance that diversity and complexity and heterogeneity of the ecosystem. And we're really using our understanding of natural disturbance, as well as importantly, an eye towards adaptation as we see things evolving and changing, but using that as a guide for that system going forward. And so I don't need to spend too much on this because Miranda will talk about this to get it first person, but this is an example, looking at oak systems, in this case, on central hardwood regions, kind of starting at, second growth oak forest condition. And so depending on whether we're talking about oak types that are truly forests, so closed canopy forests or woodlands or savannas, and then thinking through what's the logical regeneration method I use to restore that condition. And then over time, how do I intervene as that forest is developing silviculturally as a way to maintain and enhance that complexity and those conditions that we're looking for into the future. So the last thing I'll share is, as we think about, the silvicultural systems and how they translate to underlying natural disturbance regimes, this is a way just to summarize what things look like based on the interpretation of 19 different people for this textbook on what you would use as an overarching silvicultural system depending on the disturbance regime you're working in. And so this graph is just showing across the 19 examples in this forthcoming textbook, what type of regeneration method was being used for the ecological silvicultural system that was mentioned by that author. And so we have variable retention harvests, irregular shelter woods, variable density thinning, and selection methods. So first off, we can all see we're talking about multi-aged systems. So there's not really any example of an even-aged regeneration method being used. And then as we kind of move from systems where there's much more severe disturbances, those tend to often focus more on variable retention harvests or irregular shelter woods. But as we progress more towards ecosystems where mixed severity, frequent gap scale, and frequent low severity disturbance become common, you'll notice that irregular shelter woods, variable density thinning, selection methods, all of those methods tend to be kind of the preeminent ones that people are thinking about as a way to translate these silvicultural systems into methods for restoring that complexity we associate with those natural stands. So people that are far more versed in this than me, or have certainly read about this, like silviculture was intended to be in the first place, but certainly ecological silviculture, we're really trying to make this about localizing these concepts to where you are. And importantly, as opposed to maybe some of those traditional principles, trying to work with the site and work with that ecological system, both in terms of aspects of restoring the natural system, but also thinking about how can I work with what's currently on site as part of adaptation strategies going forward. And so certainly the next couple of presentations will talk about changing in disturbance regimes and how in many cases that does certainly shift us into modes where we're responding to disturbance and thinking through how do we actually deal with like these large scale disturbance events or higher mortality. And so from an ecological silviculture and a broader adaptation standpoint, that involves being thoughtful and proactive where we can to try to both minimize the impacts of those disturbances, but also when they occur, we're reacting in ways that we're thinking about what might be the adaptive outcome of that reaction in the future. And to that point, again, people often say, well, what's the value of what's natural now? And I would argue that so much of what we're talking about in terms of adaptation, so diversity of species, diversity of structures, kind of a range of gap sizes, a range of kind of conditions and applications that really are consistent with how we also think about adaptation and trying to make sure we have various options on the site. And so I really view ecological silviculture as that core building block that as we start thinking about adaptation in practice, we're using that as a scaffolding that we're jumping forward on, as opposed to kind of totally throwing away, I think, what are some really useful principles. So I will end with that. And certainly as a preview to the future webinar, I look forward to myself seeing others dig in more deeply on this in terms of their own systems and what this might look like. And so stop there.
Tony, that was awesome. And you covered just a ton of stuff. So even when we stole 12 minutes from you. So, but that was awesome. Yeah. So that was a ton, but there's a lot of questions here. And again, folks, I suspect have to leave, but we can stay on for a few minutes to answer a few of these. And so I am going to toss, again, two questions to you at the same time, and I'll set them up for you. One is from Jessica, and it relates to, she asked about defining the characteristics for various stages like lycopods and obligate biotrophs. And then she jumps down and says, Oh, I see. So just large tree density is a characteristic of stages that you're focused on. And so I think she's asking, are you really looking, are you looking at just the trees, or are you looking at all the system? And the same question comes from Keegan below, and it's the statement is forests are overstory and understory, but this ecological forestry only addresses overstory species, as far as I can tell. That blind spot for the understory, not paying attention to the non-marketable species, ignores the species that produce most of the mass utilized by wildlife. How do we balance the need for the understory development? And again, looking at the ecosystem as a whole.
Yeah, so we definitely, if that was not clear, it's a big part of it. I mean, we really are. And so even that, that non-commercial component in that original bar graph is showing, I mean, the emphasis is not on kind of maximizing wall-to-wall stocking of commercial tree species. And yeah, I guess I assume that it was implied. We're talking very much about maintaining all biota out there and trying to enhance that and accelerate kind of development of that. And those that have kind of followed some of the work that really occurred in the Northwest in response to shifts in ecological, thinking. I mean, a lot of it was just young stand thinning and diversity studies. How do we thin forest just to accelerate understory growth, to try to get more of that out there? So I think, apologize if it wasn't clear, but we definitely are trying to maintain that. I think that the tree focus is mostly because that's often what we're manipulating, and kind of the manipulation of the canopy, creating that range of gaps, and certainly trying to sustain, if there are dispersal limited understory plants that we want to make sure we maintain those populations. We're trying to do patch reserves or trying to minimize disturbance so that those populations persist on the site. So it's a big part of certainly what goes into ecological silviculture. And so the question about that timeline graph, we really were focused for that timeline to showing one attribute of old forest. But if you, I can pass along that PDF of that publication. We really were looking at all aspects of old forest, but this was just one example of one old forest attribute that could be accelerated in that case. But there's certainly certain species that, again, are dispersal limited, takes a long time for colonization. And so it may be, hundreds of years before we have large populations of those. And so in many cases, if we go back to the continuity principle, those are species that if we know they're present, we're trying to make sure we're protecting like those areas where they are within a stand or within the landscape to keep those source populations to recolonize. But yeah, that example really was focused on one aspect of a very multidimensional ecosystem, which was just a big tree component, and like getting that back.
Thank you very much. And so I'll also, again, this is a webinar unto itself, but Artemo asks, how does ecological silviculture articulate the significance of carbon sequestration and storage in mature and old growth forests? And then he goes on to say, what programs and agencies are incentivizing a carbon rich landscape?
Yeah, so I think in two ways. I mean, one, a lot of what we're talking about, if we're talking about on-site carbon, so compared to maybe a more traditional even age approach where we're not retaining anything, obviously that's we're advocating these models are leaving a lot behind, encouraging like mature trees and and those that follow kind of the literature on carbon. I mean, big trees just disproportionately have so much of that above ground biomass and certainly are critical out there. But at the same time, we know that we need kind of a mosaic of different conditions across the landscape, both within stands as well as across stands for kind of long-term, what I've learned now, we're thinking of as carbon stewardship or resilient carbon, so that it's not just all one size class or all one age class or all one condition. So like a lot of what we're talking about with ecological silviculture, having that adaptive capacity is something that we're looking for as an emergent property. We're trying to manage for like avoiding catastrophic carbon loss, over large areas by having it all kind of either even age stands that are kind of one species or vice versa, all old stands that might be kind of in one condition that may or may not fully be analog for what naturally would evolve. And so I think the key piece of it all is that we all use wood, right? And we're not decreasing like how much wood we're using. And so broadly, across the landscape, a lot of discussion right now is trying to push any type of harvesting off of public lands, which is only going to increase the amount of wood that comes from plantations and all those other areas. And I would argue, if you really want kind of a carbon friendly like wood product and a wood product that's coming from people that are thinking about not just like that crop, but they're also thinking about like soft mass production by understory plants, and they're thinking about ways to sustain different species, and they're getting public input on that. That a lot of these public lands that are already doing ecological silviculture are a great kind of, I'd say, carbon friendly source of wood for the bigger picture of what we're trying to do out there. And so I think it fits in both kind of at stand scales, but also broadly, that we need to be, deriving some of our goods from these areas that are being managed this way, if we really do care about both the sustainability for biodiversity, but also like these are better carbon models in terms of how we're managing the landscape with ecological silviculture. And so these should be places that we feel good about wood that's coming from them and kind of how it's being procured.
No, that's very helpful. So again, it's 2:08, so there's a lot of really good questions in here. So what we have tried to do in the past is questions we didn't get to, we may be able to send out kind of an addendum with those. And we also, this was recorded, and so we will have, usually it takes us about 2 weeks to get it up. And the website is where we have it posted on our partner website with the U.S. Forest Service NIACS. And so that those links are on the flyers for the series, and you can find it there. And Tony in the past has shared his presentations, and so they're usually up there as well. So you can, and there are many references in his slides. Many folks were asking for references, Tony. So you referenced your slides well. So and I also thank you to the folks that were there was a lot of information passed in the chat to others. There were links shared on cavities by Mark Nelson, and Brenda shared some information. So thanks to the wise ones out there that were sharing. So Tony, thanks so much to you and to the NCC and CTC team, and for everyone that participated. You guys make the series, so thanks for sticking with us, and we hope you can join us on October 31st when we have Jennifer Costanza talking about disturbance regimes. So thanks to all, and particularly to you, Tony. It was a great presentation, as usual. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
Have a great day.